Greetings, Mr. McKee here with our next seminar Saturdays. Today's paper is about what happens when you impose personal liability on company executives for the pollution that their company emits. The title of the paper is called Real Effects of Personal Liability, Evidence from Industrial Pollution. This is a paper by Noemie Bucourt. Apologies if I mangled your name there. And this was a paper presented at WFA in the 2025. So this is a solo paper. I'm not quite sure, but I strongly suspect this is the job market paper for the author. Just looking up the author's job market website, pretty sure that this person was on the job market either this during 2025 or the previous year. So I hope you did great. Hope you had a good placement, and I enjoyed reading your paper. So, corporate pollution. What we're looking at here is what's going to happen when we make the company executives and directors personally liable for the environment pollution that the government does. Although I think you can draw some lines here and think about what happens if we make them personally liability for other types of corporate misbehavior too. And what we're going to look at is how does the company's behavior change, and also what happens with the executives. Although I think the author can do a little bit more here. It'd be really interesting to see some things about the executives and directors, which we'll talk about way at the end. So one thing that is always something you should be thinking about when you're doing a paper like this is like, well, the first order effect, reducing environmental pollution, that's a good thing. But people respond to incentives, so they're going to respond to this increase of risk, and it's quite possible that we see negative unintended consequences of trying to stop pollution, and the problems from those negative consequences might be worse than the pollution we're trying to prevent. That's an empirical question. You'd have to do things like this paper to find out. And just as an example that I like to bring up sometimes, I have one specific example involving golden parachutes, but it happens quite a bit that politicians look at the CEOs of companies, especially the large publicly traded companies, and go, oh my gosh, they make so much money, and they have all these generous benefits like golden parachutes. This is awful. We're going to restrict it. And what seems to always happen when Congress or other legislatures in other countries try to do these things is they can do it. They're legally able to do it. The issue is they've made the CEO's life more miserable and harder. The job is riskier. It's not as nice for the CEO anymore. And so because the job is worse, companies have to pay the executive more as compensation for the lost benefit or the restriction or the extra disclosure that the CEO has to go through in order to be the CEO. So you end up with CEOs getting paid more when you were trying to make them be paid less relative to the rest of the company's workers. You might have not achieved what you were trying to do, Mr. Legislature, Congress, whoever, however you refer to your politicians. So that is always like a problem, and like it's a very consistent result that happens a bunch of times in people looking at things like executive compensation. And that's was on my mind when I was looking at this paper, because we're imposing a pretty serious financial risk on the CEOs. How are they going to react? So the empirical setting here is that law in Western countries like the United States and Canada generally is not making employees of the firm personally liable for things the company does. Now, if the employee is doing something, then you might be personally liable. But if the company itself did something and you were just one of the executives in the company, you're not necessarily going to be liable for, say, paying for environmental remediation of damages the company did, and so on. Also, shareholders are always protected too because they have limited liability. You can't go after the shareholders' personal assets. You only can go after the assets of the company. But what if the law changed? And it's not a legislation change here, it's actually a court precedent. And the court says, no, actually, you can hold executives liable. You are allowed to sue them to try and make them pay for the environmental cleanup. So there was a company called North Star in Canada. They discovered that there was some environmental pollution in their production going on back in 2004. And while they were doing cleanup of this pollution, they went bankrupt in 2012. Now, because they're in bankruptcy and there are creditors senior to the provincial government that was telling them to go clean up the pollution, they weren't going to be able to pay for doing further cleanup because there was no money. The more senior creditors got what was left of North Star. North Star was basically dead. So the provincial government, Ontario, was now responsible for dealing with this environmental pollution. And what Ontario did was the province sued the executives and directors of North Star to make them help pay for this remediation. This is in 2012, and the court in Canada accepted the settlement of this lawsuit where the executives and directors were paying several $1 million in 2013 towards this cleanup. So the court allowed the suit to go through, didn't just immediately dismiss it, and there was a settlement. You're almost always going to see settlements in lawsuits. People very, very rarely go to trial. So before this North Star case, executives had never been pursued like this. Another interesting thing for our empirical setting was this was a province level case, which is not exactly the same as a state level case in the United States, but similar. So if you were a company and you had operations in Ontario, you are now on notice. If there's pollution going on, there's a cleanup, and the province of Ontario wants to go after your executives, Ontario can do that. Companies that you're operating in a different Canadian province were less affected or not affected. There's no precedent that you can actually kind of breach that corporate shield of limited liability and go after the personal assets of the executives. So comparison between companies that operate in Ontario and Canadian companies that don't operate in Ontario is how the author is going to try to get a causal inference from, okay, we changed the law, it affects these companies and it doesn't affect some other companies. So in terms of data, Canada has a national pollutant release inventory, which is a facility level report of pollution emission, which is key because which province the facilities are in is very important. And then the author also can get CompuStat for company financials, BoardX for executive information, and also board of director information, which includes like their pay. Those two are very, very common data sources. The pollutant release inventory is much rarer. And the author gets 117 companies. 54 have at least one facility in Ontario, so they have at least some exposure to this new risk. 63 have no facilities in Ontario. So they're Canadian companies and they're operating in different provinces. It's mostly just Quebec versus Ontario here. So they're operating in Quebec, but nothing in Ontario. So their exposure is less than the other companies. Now, the author spends some time looking at if the directors and executives have degrees from U.S. universities, Ivy League, which is kind of a measure of like how elite or competent these executives and directors are. I mean, these are all Canadian companies, and I don't know specifically if it's really common for Canadian companies to hire people that have gone to the United States to get MBAs or whatever. But it might have been worth looking at elite Canadian universities, according to a friend of mine who's in academics and from Canada. That would probably be University of Toronto and McGill, the two universities that are probably the most prestigious. So looking at if they have degrees from those two universities perhaps would have been more useful than Ivy League. Again, I don't know how many of those executives even had Ivy League degrees. Of course, it did sound like this was something the author included because a referee or some comment that someone made when this paper was being presented, and a job market paper gets presented in dozens of different seminars and stuff. So like you get a lot of comments, and if you want to have your paper be successful, you generally have to include all those comments because that person might end up being the referee of your paper, and they're not going to be happy if you didn't do what they suggested. So first thing we looked at, or the author looks at, is pollution emissions. And not too surprisingly, pollution emissions go down. And the author has 8 different, models here. It doesn't really matter too much, but like it's always going down. And this is not super surprising. You've made this much more expensive to the tune of like millions of dollars. People tend to not do things when you just suddenly increase the risk by a lot. People respond to incentives. That's one of the most foundational results in economics and finance, etc., that we have. The more interesting thing to me is what else is going on. So the stock market seems to think that this is bad for these companies. The very short-term market reaction to this North Star ruling is a negative return relative to other companies for those things. And it fades away after 5 days. But again, this is not super surprising. This is imposing a new cost on companies. It's going to hurt their future prospects. Financial markets are always looking forward, not backwards. So if they would be, oh, shoot, this might make things a lot worse for companies. And it's kind of interesting to think about what the market thinks is going to be causing bad things for these companies. So we have pollution decreasing, but there's a number of ways you could decrease pollution, and they might not be ways we like, or they have bad second order consequences because of how we're doing it. So probably the best way from everyone's perspective, I think, would be that you still do your operations. You're just more careful. You're just more efficient and more careful, and so you have fewer accidents, and your process itself just generates fewer pollutants. So you just do a better job. Another solution is to say, well, we're just going to shut down our Ontario facilities and we're going to move over to Quebec, where we're not personally liable for mistakes that some random person on the production line makes, and pollution is still going to happen. It goes down in Ontario, but it goes up in Quebec. Or perhaps you're able to remove that pollutant from the production process entirely. There's probably going to be significant costs to doing that. These were known to be pollutants already, so it's not like you didn't know that there could be an expensive cleanup that the company has to pay for. This just additional incentive that it personally hurts the executives, not the shareholders of the company, means you say, well, we'll just get lower profits, but I'll be personally safe. So that's the choice I'm willing to make as the executive. And it seems like they're doing more efficient operations, higher safety. The number of hours of operation in these facilities, which I'm not quite sure where the author gets that, but that is really, really interesting. That's really interesting data to have access to. Doesn't change. Same number of hours. The existence of a pollutant doesn't go away. That's the first 3 ones here. It's pollution per hour of operation that is going down. So perhaps our good outcome here, they're just being more efficient. They're not shutting down these facilities. They're not like completely revamping their production processes, which probably has significant cost to shareholders. They're doing the good thing. Next thing to look at is what happens, kind of what type of firm is affected here. And it seems like the effect is the biggest for the large firm. So the author splits by the number of employees, and pollution's going down for the large firms. The small firms are not really decreasing it. It's a negative coefficient, but there's no statistical significance. So one potential reason for this as well, the large firms have more resources to adjust their production. So they're more able to actually reduce pollution here. And also big firms tend to pay their executives more. So those executives have a lot more to lose. If you go after the owner of a very small company, that guy probably doesn't have very much money, and so you're not actually going to be able to get very much out of him in a settlement, because he's like, look, I only have $500,000 in my retirement account. Like you can try taking that, but like it's not going to help you pay for this pollution remediation, which is a kind of an interesting thing there. And then more to lose story seems to be quite accurate, because when you look at the executives themselves, well, if you're a wealthy executive, that's where all the action is. So you're a company that's in Ontario, it's after this court case, and the ratio of wealthy, so executives that have over 5 million in net worth, is higher. That's when you decrease pollution. It doesn't matter if you have environmental experts or independent directors, or you have Ivy League graduates, or if you have people with postgraduate degrees. Nothing but if you, it's all about the personal wealth of the executives here. And this is probably correlated with firm size, because again, the bigger the firm is, the more they tend to pay their executives and directors. But there's no evidence that like non-monetary concerns or experience particularly in environmental matters actually did anything. It's all just coming from personal wealth. Okay, so pollution emissions were lower. There's some interesting things going on with the types of executives and companies that are responding to this new risk. But what else do the companies and executives do in response? Because, I mean, some of them appear to not be reducing pollution, perhaps because they can't. So, how do they deal with this extra risk? And so there's some interesting possibilities. You could buy insurance. This is risk, right? You can buy insurance for this extra risk. You could see more turnover, because the executives say, I don't want to be on the hook personally for all my money, for all my wealth. I'll just move to a different industry that doesn't pollute, or I'll just move to a company that's not doesn't do operations in Ontario, because we can't avoid pollution, or it would bankrupt the company if we tried. So like, I'm just walking away. Well, director liability insurance is a thing that companies buy. It pays out if there's liability lawsuits against the executives and directors, and these companies that are affected, that have operations in Ontario, start buying more insurance. So the total coverage is going up. The coverage scaled by the number of directors in the company is going up. And I think it'd be important to note here, the company is the one buying this coverage. It's not the individual directors that are spending some of their money to buy this coverage. The company's buying it for them, which means this is coming out of the shareholders' pockets. Now, money is somewhat fungible, but this is an increase of cost, because buying more coverage costs higher premiums that the company has to bear, because of the personal risk that the directors and executives are being forced to take on by becoming just the executive and director. So this is definitely, and would go under the unintended consequences. This is imposing a new financial burden on the companies, even though the direct effect was purely a personal assumption of risk for the executives and directors. And yes, directors tend to leave, not surprisingly. So there's more people exiting overall, and they tend to be concentrated among the people that have higher wealth. So again, not surprising, these are the ones that have the most to lose. These are the ones where the companies seem to respond the most strongly to. And so, of course, these are the guys who also tend to leave. Now, the author doesn't look at things like director experience or quality. But one thing that I do know from other readings is that the pool of potential directors and executives is actually a really small pool. That's one reason, one innocent reason, which actually I've brought up in a previous paper this semester, why you might see someone working as a director for multiple companies. There's just not that many people with the kind of high-level management experience to properly monitor these really large organizations. Well, if you're forcing out a bunch of a bunch of people from being director, well, your pool is going to be smaller. So I'd be interested in seeing, like, we have a number of metrics about like how experienced the director is, how often directors attend board meetings as a measure of like how much they're actually doing their job. Like, do those metrics start going down? Do they have a harder time finding qualified people to be directors because they're losing people, or is the market, is the job market able to absorb this reduction in size? I don't know. I think that's an interesting question to answer, even if it's just a null result. And another thing that happens is that directors with environmental experience go away. Now, that, if you remember, having more directors with environmental experience who are experts in environmental stuff, uh, that didn't change pollution. It was only if the directors were wealthy. But these are guys are also leaving, and these companies do not have as many environmental experts on their board after this law, this case that imposes personal liability. The author suggests, and I think this is quite plausible, that they understand the risk really well here because they're experts in this area and they want to avoid that exposure, so they leave. And to me, this is a very bad unintended consequence. If you are someone that is concerned about companies polluting, you want people like this to be on the board because those are exactly the best people to monitor the company, to make sure that they're following best practices to reduce environmental damage. And because you've imposed personal liability on them, they're all leaving. So now the board is not going to be as good at monitoring and keeping up with best practice for reducing environmental pollutants. And your whole goal was to reduce pollutants. Potentially a problem there. And I'm also interested in a few additional things here. So, like, what happened with director and executive compensation? Because a lot of times when you increase risk like this or impose some additional restrictions on what they can do, they get paid more. So does that happen? The author doesn't do this. I would, I'm being I'm being an annoying referee here and saying, can't you do like these 3 or 4 other things? But I do think this would kind of help the paper and kind of support like the second order effects of what happens, how do companies respond to this new risk. And one thing could be like, well, we have to pay our CEOs more because they have this additional personal risk. And then of course I mentioned director quality earlier. Do boards become lower quality? Do executives become lower quality? We have, and a kind of a third order effect here. We have a lot of metrics about trying to measure corporate governance, how good of a job the board is doing, and making sure that the company is aligned to shareholders, not to the personal benefit of like the CEO or something. Do those metrics get worse following this? Probably because the board wouldn't be as effective. I was hoping to see this and I didn't see it. And I doubt the author will ever listen to this, but like if I was a referee, those were things I'd be asking for. Like, hey, what happened with director quality? What happened with compensation? That's the kind of things I'm thinking of. I was thinking of as reading this paper and I didn't see it, and I would love to see that. I think it would make the paper a lot better. Even if they're null results, that's still interesting to me because then it's kind of contradicting what some other results have shown in previous executive compensation papers. Anyways, to conclude, if you hold executive and directors personally liable for the environmental remediation of company pollution, you do indeed appear to reduce pollution by companies. However, also kind of unsurprisingly, the companies and the executives and directors will respond in logical ways to mitigate this new risk for that hurts them. And I think some of the ways they are responding are probably going to hurt shareholders. And the real concerning thing here, if your goal was to try and reduce pollution, is you're losing environmental expertise on the board. So the exact type of director that you probably want more of, not less, is no longer on the board. And that may, while current pollution may go down, there might be pollution problems in the future because you don't have people with environmental experience on the board anymore. And that is, that is speculative on my part. This is a relatively recent ruling, 20 only about 10 years in the past. So there isn't a lot of time for some major mistake to happen because they didn't have someone with environmental expertise. But like that is a potential risk that I'm thinking like this could be a problem if you lose this environmental expertise because you were trying to reduce pollution now. You might end up with more pollution in the future, which is probably not what we actually want to do here. All right, so that concludes our paper for this week. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, please comment, like, and or subscribe. I would love to hear comments about this paper or other interesting things that you thought of as you were reading this paper. That is the discussion after the presentation is just as interesting as a PhD student as presenting the paper yourself. And we have still a few more weeks in the semester, so I'll be back next week with another paper from WFA.